Okay, I said that I would do a short recording about how I would do my cheat sheet for the exam. And a lot of students tell me that they're a visual person or something like that. If you're a visual person, draw pictures because that's going to help you. So I just started out this sheet with a blank sheet of paper and I drew in um not an anatomically perfect, but I just sketched in a little sternum and part of the rib cage and a little clavicle and scapula and humerus and radius and ulna and a little hand. So I started that out and then I took my learning objectives and I started looking at them and saying, what do I want to remember? So one of the learning objectives was all the different joints and the type of joint they are. So I went in and I wrote um, the SC joint is a saddle joint. The AC joint is a planar joint. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to remember the glenohumeral joint is a ball and socket joint, so I didn't write that in. You don't have to write everything. I wrote the humeral-ulnar joint is a hinge joint. The humeral radial joint um, is a pivot joint. I didn't write that in, but the proximal radial ulnar is a pivot, and the distal radial ulnar is a pivot. And the radiocarpal is an ellipsoid joint. So I wrote in those joints. I'm pretty sure I'm going to remember that the IP joints are hinge joints. Um, and the metacarpophalangeal joints are condyloid joints. But if you're not going to remember that, write it in. I wrote that the first CMC joint, carpometacarpal joint, is the saddle joint. And I sort of have my carpals here, but they're not perfect. But then I wrote something about the scaphoid just to remember it's the floor of the anatomical snuff box and it's most fractured. I could write one of the learning objectives was how does the latissimus dorsi function in crutch walking? So I drew my little stick figure here with crutches and I said the lats pull the thorax through the arms. So that's going to remind me what happens in crutch walking. Um, with the lever questions, what I wrote to remind myself how to analyze those is I said, check gravity first. If gravity is the force causing the motion, then it's eccentric. If muscle is the force, then it's concentric. So no matter what the joint motion is, if gravity is the force, it's an eccentric motion. So I wrote that down. That's going to help me analyze those lever questions. I wrote down that the serratus anterior is um, innervated by the long thoracic nerve and it prevents scapular winging. So I didn't write a ton about it, but I just wrote a little bit about it. I have some, I'm drawing on the screen here. So I did the peripheral nerves. I did MARMU. That's my mnemonic for the nerves. So the musculocutaneous, I just briefly wrote, it does elbow flexion. Axillary is the delts. Radial nerve is the posterior arm. It does wrist extension. The median nerve is the lateral hand and goes through the carpal tunnel. Ulnar is the deep hand muscles. I put a space here for force couples. If you can't remember the force couples for upward and downward rotation. I also wrote in here upward rotation and downward rotation of the scapula, and that the scapulothoracic joint is a functional joint. And I abbreviated, sure, I abbreviated. Rotator cuff muscles, I wrote that there were four. You could write what they are if you want. You could write the force couples in. You could write the muscles that make up the thenar and the hypothenar eminence. You could write that they're a flexor, an abductor, and an opponens. And then you know that if it's pollicis, it's the thumb, and if it's digiti minimi, it's the hypothenar. Pollicis is the thenar. So what I'm saying is a lot of people told me, a couple people told me that they had trouble finding something on their sheet because they kind of wrote too much. So what you're trying to write on this sheet is not everything. It's trying to look at your learning objectives, write down things that are going to remind you of the stuff you think you might forget. Write down tips or mnemonics or something like that. Like I wrote something about the Serratus anterior prevents scapular winging because that's sort of a weird special muscle, and there is a learning objective about that. I wrote down that the scaphoid is the floor of the anatomical snuff box and is the most frequently fractured carpal bone. I wrote down the joint types. You could write down the motions available at each joint if you think you're going to forget those. Sometimes just writing the joint type, you go, oh, well, the AC joint's a planar joint, so it probably has 2 degrees of freedom. So sometimes just writing a little thing to remind you is better. You could write that the trochlea is more inferior than the capitulum, so it causes normal cubitus valgus or the carrying angle of the elbow. So just little things, take your learning objectives. See if there's ones that you know you've got them cold, don't write them on your sheet. If there's ones that you keep forgetting, every time you go through your flashcards, you forget that one thing, write that down. So use the cheat sheet to your advantage. Don't put so much information on there that you can't use it. And use pictures. I'm really big on pictures because pictures work. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions for me about that, let me know. So any pictures that you put on there have to be ones drawn by you. So my little stick figure crutch walker down here, he's not very artistic, but it gets me the information I need to know. I spent a little more time drawing the upper extremity, not very much though. I just did a rough sketch. And so pictures have to be drawn by yourself, by your own hand. You can't like print a picture and stick it on there, but you can do it and you can give yourself a good cheat sheet. So hopefully this was helpful.